Greetings and welcome to the second Hrant Dink Memorial Peace and Justice Lecture. As you know, we inaugurated the series last year with Rashid Khalidi, Professor Khalidi of Columbia University. And this year we are continuing with another illustrious speaker, Sir Geoffrey Nice, who I shall introduce after a few minutes. But first, allow me to introduce, please, Mrs. Rakel Dink, who is visiting, again, honoring us with a second visit this year. Raquel is well known in Turkey as a person very active in human rights and women's rights issues, causes, movements, as well as being the president of the Hrant Dink Foundation, which has, over the course of the last few years, also done remarkable work in the same venues and some others which I will mention later on. So without further ado, I would first like to introduce or call to the podium Rakel Dink, please. Buyurun.
İyi akşamlar, hepiniz hoş geldiniz. Çok derin duygularla tekrar gerçekten karşınızda duruyorum bu anma vesilesiyle.
Welcome and good evening to you all. I stand here with deep feelings for the commemoration occasion again this evening with you.
Bu anmaların gerçekten bizi çok etkilediğini, aynı zamanda insanların birbirlerine dokunuşlarını hissettiriyor ve bu eşimin adım attığı bu amacı uğruna insanların da içine girerek, bu amacın içine girerek bu hizmette paydaş olarak bizi duygulandırıyor tekrar.
This commemoration, taking into account the steps that my late husband took and the expansion of the interaction between peoples is, I find very touching.
Ve tekrar teşekkür ediyorum Harvard Üniversitesi'nin bütün sorumlularına ve bu konuda özellikle Henry Parsegian'in ve konuşmacı Geoffrey Nice'in çok teşekkür ediyorum ve çok duygulanıyoruz. Gerçekten dünyada birçok sözü geçen insanların bir araya gelip bu konuda, insan hakları konusunda ve özellikle Türkiye gibi bir ülkeye bence bunların hepsinin faydası var.
I thank Harvard again for creating this occasion and Harry Parsegian and others for the occasion to come together and bringing the leading voices of human rights around the world and creating an occasion like this. And I think this is beneficial also for a place like Turkey.
Ve gene söyleyeyim, gene çok duygulanıyorum böyle bir yerde. Özellikle eşim ve ben de yatılı bir okuldan çıkmış çocuklar olarak ve gerçekten doğruluk uğruna verdiği mücadelenin sonucunda böyle bir yerde anılıyor olmak ayrı bir onur bizler için.
I feel touched and honored having myself and my husband also grown up in a boarding school. To be in a place like this again, to remember him, I feel very honored.
Ve gönül isterdi ki ülkemiz için, doğduğumuz, büyüdüğümüz, atalarımızın yaşadığı ülke için iyi şeyler konuşaydık.
And we wish, and our hearts wish that for the country that we were born and grown up and our ancestors came from, that we could speak positively and good things about the country.
Fakat maalesef yaşadıklarımız ve bizler de 1915 Ermeni soykırımının kılıç artıklarının torunları olarak yani iyi bir şey söylemek için gerçekten yani arayıp bulmak lazım.
as the survivors and those who survived the 1915 events and genocide in Turkey, those of us who have left behind after that, it's hard for us to find some good things to talk about.
Çünkü Ermeni oldun mu zaten bir aşağılanıyorsun, bir hakarete uğruyorsun, bir korkular içinde yaşamayı öğreniyorsun. Fakat çok şükür ediyorum gene bu yaşanmışlıkların içinde ama başını kaldırıp soru sorabilen, kimliğini koruyabilen ve gerçekten sırf kendisi için değil etrafındaki insanların da haksızlığa uğrayan insanların da hakkını savunmaya kalkabilen kişiler çıkıyor Türkiye'den. Bunun için sevinçliyiz ve onlar için de özellikle biri Ermeni çıktıysa maalesef hayatına son verdiler.
Unfortunately, living as an Armenian in Turkey, there is still a lot of injustices, and Armenians are looked down upon. But having said that, there are still voices that raise out of that crowd and speak against injustice, and having those voices be Armenian voices coming up to question the injustices is heartening.
Bütün bu konular için aslında Agos çıktı. Agos'u kurdu, yayına başladı Agos ve gerçekten iyi şeyler eksin diye, hatta ilk başlığı Agos'un, Agos Ermenice ark demek, toprakta açılan ark, tohum ekilsin diye. Dediği başlığı şuydu, biz bir ark açtık, iyi tohumu olan getirsin eksin.
And that was the purpose of starting Agos when Agos was started. And in fact, the name Agos means the opening in earth where the seeds are laid. And that was the purpose, to say this is the opening for whomever has seeds to bring and plant so that they can be flourishing.
Evet, iyilik ne? İyilik de aslında doğruluktur. İyilik hakkı, adaleti, doğruluğu savunmaktır. İyilik gerçeği olduğu gibi söylemektir. İyilik dostunu korumaktır.
Goodness is to speak against injustice. It is to do well. It is to protect your friends.
Ve biz yatılı okulda öğrendiklerimizin başında gelir. Doğruluk için, adalet için elem çekenlere ne mutlu der Tanrı'nın sözü.
And that's one of the things that we learned in school and boarding school is that to do justice, to do good for those who are suffering, that's the command of God.
Çünkü her şey geçecek ama doğruluk kalacak, gerçek kalacak. Ben uzun konuşmayacağım çünkü asıl konuşmacımız önemli ve onu dinleyeceğiz burada.
And goodness is the only thing. Everything is passing. Everything will pass, but goodness and justice is that will stay. I will not speak for very long here, since we do have a speaker after.
Ve doğruluk hiçbir zaman kaybolmayacak. Her zaman doğru olan kazanacaktır. Bugün Türkiye'de tekrar görüyoruz ve gerçekten çok üzgünüz ve herkes mücadele etmeli ki savaş olmasın hiçbir yerde. Kimse evsiz kalmasın, kimse yurtsuz kalmasın, kimse perişanlık çekmesin. Kimse doğduğu yerden ayrılmak zorunda kalmasın ister gönül.
Justice will stay. Everybody should work so that there is no war. People aren't displaced. They are not suffering. They're not pushed out of where they live, and that's what heart wants.
Tekrar teşekkür ediyorum gerçekten bu değerli akşam için ve mücadelemizde katkılarınız için her zaman minnettarlığımız, insanlık adına minnettarlık duyacağız.
Thank you very much again for this evening. Thank you very much again for all of your efforts and your efforts on behalf of humanity.
Ve başarılar diliyoruz insanlık mücadelesinde. Hepinizin gerçekten payınız olacağına inanıyorum, olduğuna inanıyorum. Teşekkürler.
and I wish you success in all of your endeavors and your struggles on the name of humanity. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Raquel, for those moving words. Hoş geldiniz, teşekkürler. Before introducing our speaker, I would like to say a few words about the life of the man we are memorializing. Born in 1954 and assassinated in 2007, Hrant Dink left a lasting legacy that we are here to memorialize and to celebrate. Widely recognized as a brilliant writer, journalist, intellectual, advocate of the right of minorities and of the oppressed, even when he himself faced persecution, precocious explorer of new paths toward understanding and recognition and reconciliation among Turks and Armenians. Widely recognized in all these ways at the time of his death, Hrant was taken from us by an assassin's bullet and a sinister plot. His funeral turned into an unprecedented demonstration of sympathy and mourning, where crowds in Istanbul and millions who stood in solidarity throughout the country and the world came out to express a widely shared, but up to that point suppressed or unarticulated sentiment of support for the values that Hrant articulated, represented, and embodied. He, in fact, became an iconic figure thereafter in the ongoing negotiation in Turkey, not necessarily successful, but at least ongoing negotiation around reckoning with the past, and the assertiveness to speak about things that were considered unspeakable in Turkish public life. If any of that happened, to the degree that it happened, Hrant's legacy, Hrant's work during his lifetime and his legacy are the most important factors in it. He was born in Malatya in 1954, and his father was a fine tailor. This is not about his family so much, but the orphanage years I'll get to in a second. His father was a fine tailor and a terrible gambler, whose ruinous addiction led the family in 1961, when Hrant was only 7, to Istanbul, where things got only worse, because his mother started her sad and debilitating struggle with mental illness. He, Hrant, and his siblings were enrolled in an orphanage which offered shelter and education. That's a scene from the school. He had particularly fond memories of the children's summer camp in Tuzla, where he would meet the love of his life, Raquel. This is a fabled story that anyone who reads about Hrant reads about and would like to read more about. The fable has it that he was only 15, the same age as Romeo, and as fables go, it's one of the most moving ones. He started the prestigious high school of the Armenian community in the late 1960s, when he also came under the influence of radical leftist movements, like many of the best and the brightest of his generation. The transition from a flower child to Maoist was not that unusual in those years, especially in the so-called third world that many of you would probably find familiar. In 1971, he enrolled in Istanbul University as a student of zoology, and he would graduate after 14 years in 1985, after 14 years of activism, militant politics, custody and jail time, and a variety of odd jobs like selling watches, selling carpets. Married in 1977, Raquel and Hrant took over the Tuzla summer camp where they had met. In 1980, they took over the summer camp when the military junta arrested the director who had shaped that institution and served as mentor to a whole generation of Armenian youths of modest means. The summer camp would later be confiscated and closed down in 1986 after 6 years of turbulent, but at least on-the-job management by Hrant and Rakel. In 1986, it was confiscated and closed down, and the case is still continuing to retrieve. Hrant eventually opened a bookshop with his brothers as a more regular business and started doing well. In 1993, he was co-founder of Aras Publishing House, which had as its aim to offer Turkey a window into Armenian literature. Thereabouts, he seems to have found his public voice and vocation. And in 1996, with the support of several Armenian intellectuals and the Patriarch, he started Agos, a very important, a remarkable intervention in public life in Turkey. Among many other such examples, Agos really stands out as one of the most impressive and one of the most influential organs to shape public debate over the course of the last 2 decades. From 1996 to 2007, he was editing, writing for, and managing Agos. Another translation is the furrow opened by the plow for sowing seeds. And it's used also by some Turks in Anatolia in Turkish conversation, but the word is Armenian. He was editing, writing for, and managing Agos, the first ever venture of a minority community in the history of the late Ottoman Empire and Republican Turkey, the first ever such venture to turn into a platform that appealed to the broad public, and a platform where many of the most resonant and salient debates of Turkish public life, with or without any bearing on the Armenian community, found themselves a place. This was the great success of Agos and of Hrant Dink, and what made him more dangerous than just a voice for his community. Agos aimed to transcend parochialism by reporting regularly about developments in Armenia and among the diaspora, by bringing the voices of non-Turkish Armenian intellectuals and artists into the mix, but also, and most importantly in terms of the consequences, by dealing with matters that simply had nothing to do with Armenians as such. He spoke to issues and enabled Agos to speak to issues of broad public concern. The rights of the Kurds, or the women with headscarves, were all parts of Agos's coverage. And in terms of the tensions or controversies between Turks and Armenians, he emphasized the diversity of these communities, stood up against essentializations of all sorts. He was a different voice, sometimes in nuanced ways, sometimes in more direct criticism of prevalent attitudes and discourses. His emphasis was on reconciliation by direct human encounters and engagements between Armenians and Turks. To put it more romantically, by touching the hearts of people, rather than decisions and declarations by parliaments or politicians. He did not wish anti-denial laws enacted in some European countries punishing denial of the genocide, to determine public discourse and to silence people into legalistic compliance or political correctness. He took everyone on their own terms because he was respectful, genuinely respectful of the dignity and humanity of others, including or even especially those with whom he disagreed. And none of his intellectual positions would probably have mattered otherwise. He is well remembered and recognized as a person who touched, indeed, as he wanted to, people's hearts, and that's what rendered them all the more dangerous. Ultimately, he was stepping on too many toes, and some of those toes wore boots. When he published a news story about Sabiha Gökçen, an adopted daughter of Atatürk's and the first female pilot of the Republic, claiming she had been one of the orphans of the genocide, he was reprimanded by the General Staff, which issued a public statement against Agos. This was a particularly difficult moment for dissenters in recent Turkish history when ultranationalists were most visible, actively engaged in silencing, threatening, or plotting acts of violence. And at least some of this, we now know better, at least some of this was happening with the active involvement or encouragement of the secret services of the state. Soon after the Sabiha Gökçen controversy, Hrant wrote a piece that was perceived by the prosecutors as constituting insult to Turkishness, a criminal act according to the notorious item 301 of the Turkish Penal Code. 2 days after he brought his case to the European Court of Human Rights in January 2017, he was shot dead in front of the building where Agos was and to this day is published. This is the scene, now iconic, of his body lying there right after his tragic death. The funeral cortege and public demonstration with which I started is one of the turning points in contemporary history. Every year, a commemorative public procession, which is a civil society initiative, takes place along that street and in front of Agos, as people now refer to that building. There is now also a Hrant Dink Foundation. Raquel is the president of the foundation, a vibrant institution studying issues related to human rights, collective memory, tangible and intangible cultural heritage associated with different faiths and traditions of Anatolia. There are other commemorative events such as conferences and lecture series in Turkey and elsewhere. And it is one of those generous acts to remember and to celebrate the life of Hrant Dink that brings us together here tonight. Namely, the Hrant Dink Memorial Lecture Series, sponsored by Harry Parsekian and Friends of Hrant Dink here in Boston, Massachusetts. To Harry and friends, I would like to express my, and I'd like to say our, to the degree I can speak on behalf of the institution, heartfelt gratitude. Thank you, Harry. Organizationally, I'm supposed to mention one thing, that we do have a reception after our speaker presents his lecture, the Hrant Dink Memorial Lecture, and that is in Fay House, which is right next door. And our speaker today is a legal professional, a legal mind with an illustrious career in defense of human rights. How appropriate, I think, I'm sure you would all agree, to honor, to memorialize, to remember Hrant Dink, and also, of course, to take his message into the much larger and universal framework of human rights and memory, as the lecture series is titled. Sir Geoffrey is the Gresham College Professor of Law, and he has worked at the International Criminal Tribunal for the Former Yugoslavia between 1998 and 2006, the most important years of the work of that tribunal from the point of view of what had been happening in the early 90s in the Balkans, of course. And he led the prosecution of Slobodan Milošević, former president of Serbia. Much of his work since has been connected to cases before the Permanent International Criminal Court or pro bono for victims groups whose cases cannot get to any international court. I'm sure Hrant would be particularly touched by that last point about Sir Geoffrey's one, I mentioned here, one of many accomplishments and distinctions. So without further ado, I present Sir Geoffrey Nice to speak on complex truths in trials of conflicts.
The honor of being invited to give this lecture is much enhanced by giving it in the presence of Mrs. Rakel Dink. The responsibility that falls on me is much enlarged by having to follow the inspirational lecture of Professor Khalidi that I saw online. I must tonight try to inform a very mixed audience of some things you may not know, and maybe to provoke some thoughts that you may find worth dwelling on. The three professions that I've already identified, in a sense, the journalist, the historian, and now me, the lawyer, all deal with setting narratives, but always in very different ways. Professor Khalidi impressed me very much by the way in which he was able, in his lecture, to express personal commitment, emotion even, without in any way undermining the power of his argument. For historians can do that. They can choose and they can present and argue. Journalists, too, can include some emotion in what they say, but of course they have to be careful, because if they are too emotional, they undermine the integrity of the narrative they set. Hrant Dink, as I understand it, was always one who acknowledged the other side, the other point of view. I'm very happy about that. My father was in the print, not as a journalist, but as a technical man, as was his father, on Fleet Street, where papers were made, and he gave me, as a boy, one important bit of philosophy picked up from the biographer of Voltaire, who spoke of fighting to the death for the right of the other person's argument to be heard. And so it is that although I'm probably, I have to tell you, the sort of person who might believe that the best way for the world to be run would be by liberal non-believers, I also have to accept, thinking of the other side's point of view, that I could be completely wrong in that. The third profession, the lawyer, well, the lawyer must avoid emotion if his dispassionate representation of a cause in setting a narrative is to be trusted. There will be some pretend emotion, some synthetic emotion in the cross-examination of a witness here or there, or a closing argument, but it must be seen for the synthetic that it is. And so it is that these three professions do the same sort of thing, but in very different ways. And so do many other professions. And that's one of the reasons that it's possible for us all, or many of us, when it suits us, to rely on that platitude, there is no such thing as the truth. And to repeat it. Well, of course, it's quite good, really, isn't it, for repeat business? You can give the same version, then you can give a different one. But let me tell you, that is a platitude that is a lament in the ears of those, for example, those who are the victims of conflict and who seek not uncertainty, but the truth, and who need the truth, or something as near to the truth as they can get, before they are able to move forward, before they are able to resolve the unhappiness that has beset their lives. Let me give you one example out of many that I could of why this is important to consider. For those of you who don't know about the Yugoslav conflict, I need only tell you one thing. Bosnia had separated from Serbia at the time of the killings in Srebrenica of the 8,000 Muslim men and boys. The relations of the men and boys want to know and want to have decided whether Serbia itself, through its government and its leader, Slobodan Milošević, were directly responsible for the genocide, as there has found to be, that happened in Srebrenica. That's what they want to know. Various court proceedings have lasted 22 years, and that question has not been resolved. The roughest of calculations, making a modest assumption that each of the 8,000 will have had 4 separate relations or friends much affected by the death, and then making another rough calculation about the average rate of natural death as people age, means that in that 22 odd years, there will have been at least 10,000 people who will have died, not having the issue that concerns them about that genocide, as it has been described, resolved. Have the processes that have taken 22 years not to reach a conclusion served the victims, this kind of victim, the bereaved, well? No. And maybe those of us concerned with these things should count it as our duty to find ways to do 2 things, both to narrow the gap between the truth that does exist, however hard it may be to find, and the versions of truth that authoritative bodies can deliver, and also to speed up the process. I will give you, I hope, some 3 parts of my thinking and experience, in the hope that from those 3 parts you may see something of the whole, recognizing that, of course, I have this very particular personal and whatever it may be point of view. The first of the 3 parts, and the most difficult one probably for some of you to contemplate, is the difficulties, because that's what we must look for. We must find out why the gap between truth and what can be delivered is so large. One of the problems may be the law itself. I realize many of you in the audience are not lawyers, so a survey of the law in almost seconds, the relevant law. There was no law of war until the middle 19th century. Then, with the Libya Code for the American Civil War Union side, and with Hague Conventions and Geneva Conventions about prisoners and about weapons that could not be used, the law developed. And after the First World War, there were a very limited number of trials of people committing crimes in war, very limited, with modest sentences in Leipzig, and only of the defeated band, the other side, as it were. Nothing then, until the Second World War, when, as you will perhaps all know, at Nuremberg and in Tokyo, there were more serious, much more serious trials, again, only of the defeated, and for various reasons they came to an end quite quickly. Nothing, or at any event, nothing public then on this topic until 1993, when the Rwanda and the Yugoslav tribunals were set up by the United Nations, quite possibly out of guilt that the international community felt at its failures, followed by some internationalized tribunals for Cambodia, Sierra Leone, East Timor, Lebanon, and then the so-called permanent International Criminal Court, which is perhaps none of those things because a large number of countries aren't signed up to it, like America, Russia, and China, and because its permanence is by no means guaranteed, not least because now African states are talking of withdrawing. That's the history. And there are two moments in that history which I'm going to invite you to say are extremely important. The second in time is indeed 1993, when the Rwanda and Yugoslavian tribunals were established, not necessarily because of their verdicts, which may or may not be of interest in years to come, nor even because of the phenomenal records of evidence that they leave, but for another reason. It was then, and then only, that the citizen was allowed, the world citizen was allowed to think for the first time that there should be accountability for crimes in war. Until then, it couldn't be in the conversation. There was nowhere for such people to be tried. Now there is, at least for the time being. The second event, which also changed completely the way people think, happened 45 years earlier at the end of the Second World War, when Raphael Lemkin, as many of you may know, coined, and for the first time, the term genocide. He defined it in a very different, broader way from the way it's applied now. But when it came to the time when the four great powers were deciding how to try German alleged war criminals, he was active in seeking to have his concept of genocide considered. Well, it wasn't, or it was, but it wasn't as a crime in the Nuremberg Charter. And it's here that I want you just to consider a little bit of detail that is quite significant. At that time, crimes against humanity was a concept better understood than genocide, which was very recent. Crimes against humanity was around maybe for a couple of hundred years, and certainly as a legal concept for 50 years. And it was one of the crimes included in the Nuremberg Charter. The Avalon Project, for those of you familiar with it, provides us with transcripts of the meetings of the London Conference of the four great powers deciding what should be in the Charter. Focus on what was said by Justice Jackson, leading for America, about crimes against humanity. He said this: "It's been a general principle of foreign policy of our government from time immemorial that the internal affairs of another government are not ordinarily our business. The reason that this program of extermination of Jews and destruction of the rights of minorities becomes an international concern is this: it was part of a plan for making an illegal war. Unless we have a war connection as the basis for reaching them, I would think we have no basis for dealing with atrocities," he said. And then he said this: "We have some regrettable circumstances at times in our own country in which minorities are unfairly treated." I don't know whether he had in mind the lynching of African Americans or the massacres of Native Americans, but it's what drove his, and it was no doubt an idea with which the other three great powers, France and England and Russia, all agreed. But he went on to make it quite clear: we think that it is justifiable that we interfere or attempt to bring retribution to individuals or to states only because the concentration camps and the deportations were in pursuance of a common plan or enterprise of making an unjust or illegal war in which we became involved. Lemkin realized, and you can see Professor Shabas's book on the topic, I think it's called Unimaginable Atrocities, the book. Lemkin realized that this meant the Holocaust itself would not be the subject of involvement by other powers unless it was specifically connected to a war of which America was a party. So he realized that crimes against humanity then could not cover these other greater crimes. And so he went to America, he went to New York, or he was already there, and he committed himself daily to bringing about the Genocide Convention and then to having it ratified. Before he died in the mid-50s, probably a slightly difficult, lonely man with, I think, under 10 people at his graveside, having lost all but one member of his family in the Holocaust. It is such people, strange though they may be, who change the way we think. But let's just go back to what happened following Justice Jackson's position in the London Conference. Well, the war crime at Nuremberg for crimes against humanity did indeed limit those crimes to those that were in execution of or in connection with any crime within the jurisdiction of the tribunal. That linkage remained. It didn't last for long, but long enough to justify the introduction of the Genocide Convention. And the uncomfortable argument that has to be considered is this. Had America not taken that position, and the other great powers joining it, no doubt, then all that is now said, both presently and prospectively and retrospectively, to be genocide, would, as it still could, be covered as a crime against humanity. And the uncomfortable question that has to be considered, and I'll come to my own views on this later, is whether it might not have been as good for everyone to have lived with the crime of crimes against humanity and for genocide to have remained a social concept and construction, more general than a specific crime that it has become. Incidentally, although genocide didn't make it as a crime onto the statute book or onto the charter, it did feature in the indictments, which set out things in detail, but rather curiously, as part of the allegations under a different crime, war crimes, and you can see the citation or the quotation there where it said that the various things constituting war crimes were conducted as deliberate and systematic genocide, the extermination of racial and national groups against the civilian population of certain territories in order to destroy particular races and classes of people and national, racial, or religious groups, particularly Jews, Poles, Gypsies, and others. And for those of you who find this an interesting topic, this man, still alive, Ben Ferencz, is the sole surviving prosecutor from the follow-on trial to the Nuremberg trials, the Einsatzgruppen trial. And if you go to YouTube and watch his opening speech, you can see him there giving it as a younger man. You'll hear him use the term genocide, I think, 3 times. You can actually pick up on the history of how an idea is used and introduced into the language of all nations and has now become part of the way we think. Oh, and by the way, here he is being honored at Harvard. But this is the Convention on Genocide. This is what genocide means in legal terms. That it's various acts, including killings, committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. That's the 1948 Convention, and here's the same thing in the Rome Statute of the Permanent International Criminal Court. And it's the word intent that really distinguishes it from crimes against humanity. There are other distinguishing features. You have to prove this very curious, this odd, this extremely unhealthy intention in somebody's brain before you can bring in a conviction for genocide in law. It's not easy to prove the necessary mental intent of a domestic crime of murder or the domestic crime of a conspiracy to murder. But it's important that we all understand, those of us who may be engaged in thinking about genocide and how it should be dealt with, formally or informally, to understand that you have to prove for the legal definition this very particular intent, the intent to destroy, in whole or part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. Let me, and there's the same thing in the Rome Statute. Now, let me turn to some of the realities of prosecuting crimes where genocide is alleged, because we need to have them in mind. The crime is in many ways a celebrity crime. It's said to be the crime of all crimes, the worst crime. No, bear in mind that may not be true. To let off an atomic bomb in a major city of the world would not be genocide. The Twin Towers was not genocide. But nevertheless, the public conception is that genocide is the worst of all crimes. That means that in an office like the office of the prosecutor of the Yugoslav tribunal, you would have inter-office rivalry about whether something was or was not genocide, whether it should be genocide on the indictment. How much would that impress the victims? With a crime of this gravity, you would quite inevitably attract people seeking to influence things, either because it would or would not be a good thing for this person to be charged with such an offence if you were seeking other geopolitical results elsewhere. And let me just give you an example of the sort of things that happen. This, the case of Milošević, was the very first genocide case to reach a conclusion at the Yugoslav tribunal, and I prosecuted most of it. He was a very low-level person. You can see him there shooting somebody after a so-called interrogation, and you can see the other bodies at the end of the lane. He was charged with genocide by the then prosecutor, Louise Arbour, and she was subject to considerable pressure by the judges, informal pressure, to say that, well, don't try him for genocide. He's already pleaded guilty to killings by another way. Leave it at that. She resisted. The case went on. At the end of the prosecution's case, the judges, without a word from me, and indeed without allowing me to speak, without allowing me to make any argument, announced that they were going to acquit him of genocide in a decision that many people found hard to understand. The appeals chamber found it hard to understand as well, because they decided that there was enough evidence for him to be tried for genocide, that we should have been given an opportunity to argue it, but they then decided that there wouldn't be a retrial. So this was a little internal political battle. What would the victims think about that? But there are worse examples. In the Milošević case, we had some very good evidence about particular meetings which showed the relationship between the President of Serbia, you remember the red bit on the map, and Mladić, who was achieving the genocidal killing of the 8 people in Bosnia at Srebrenica. Remember that bit of the map? We had evidence of the relationship, and it was very good. Unfortunately, by an agreement made between Serbia and the prosecutor of the court, the best bits were kept from public view. They are now actually available for public view, but too late for anybody to show much of an interest. So here, the people of Bosnia were kept away from what they expected to be the best evidence showing whether it was or wasn't genocide by Serbia. Why? Who knows? But that's the sort of thing that happens in trials like this. Here's another one, except that the slide looks a bit different, doesn't it? transcripts of phone calls between Milošević and Mladić at the time of Mladić's taking of Srebrenica. We know those transcripts exist. We know the phone calls happened. Why is the slide blank? Because an entity entered the office of the prosecutor and we were required to withdraw the application to have those transcripts. Why? Not in order to improve the trial, not in order to improve the stated knowledge of those people, including the 10,000 I calculate have now died, who wanted to know what actually happened. Why? Probably because those transcripts would have shown more about what the rest of the world knew was happening. And thank you very much. The interests of the rest of the world are greater than the interests of the victims. Or this. These men took these young boys from Srebrenica and killed them. And we believed that not only were they part of the Serbian proper forces, they were paramilitary forces, but they were answerable to this man, a Serbian police general. Well, we played the video that showed this terrible thing and showed direct connection of the crimes at Srebrenica to Serbia and wanted to investigate so that we could prove the case better. You'd expect us to do that, wouldn't you? I don't know why we were stopped, but we were. These are the realities, or some of them. And there are other realities about genocide as a crime. People know that if it's attached informally or formally to an event, whether by a leading politician or by a film star, it draws to that event a significance and importance in the mind of others that other such events won't attract. Maybe it disturbs the balance of public attention. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? I don't know. But what I do know, and why I tell you all this, is that for anyone who embarks, whether in an informal or a formal way, of making an allegation of genocide, there is the start of a process that is likely to both raise expectations, but all too often to bring disappointment. Every conviction for genocide in the criminal courts or for aiding and abetting genocide brings an appeal, an extended period of time in which the uncertainty continues. Every acquittal will bring an appeal by the prosecution, extending the time of uncertainty. And that's not really entirely surprising, because the only way you can prove genocide in a criminal court is by looking at the overall circumstances of the attack and saying whether that was or was not itself genocidal, and then looking at the individual you've got on trial, Mr. A, Mr. B, Mr. C, and saying, what was his mental state? Was he shown to have that very particular mental state or not? And it's very difficult to look inside someone's head. Much more difficult than it would be, or would have been, to look at the same events from the point of view of a crime like the crime against humanity, where of course you have to have an intention to do the things that constituted the crime, but you don't have to have this warped mental state. That is genocide. So, we have to at least ask the question whether having genocide as a crime has served a purpose. I said I'd tell you what my view is, and so I will. For some time, I rather took the view that it was troublesome in a way that was not merited, because it consumes so much judicial time, it postpones certainty, or it guarantees uncertainty. But I think I've changed my mind, or at least I've developed my thinking. And for this reason, lawyers and politicians, maybe for cynical reasons, maybe for practical reasons, took what Lemkin initially gave and developed it into something that we can now all think about. However inaccurately it may be presented in newspapers and on television, but it is the public's turn. It is our turn, it's not the lawyer's turn. And if we want to be able to conceive of crimes in the way that people do conceive of genocide, recognizing how difficult it may be to deal with them in courts or even informally, then it's not for lawyers and judges to deprive us of that opportunity. And if it's already been the case that the setting of the narratives of history includes findings about genocide, and there are other findings that may yet be made, then they've got to be given a chance, formally or informally. So that, for example, the disappointed people in Bosnia, the mothers of Srebrenica as they're called, and all the others, if they have a chance of correcting another unsatisfactory verdict of the International Court of Justice, which deals with breaches of the Convention itself, state against state as opposed to crimes by individuals, if they want to have another go at putting that record right, difficult though it will be, then they must take it, because it's in the interests of the way their history is being written that they should do so. So that's my view. And I'll pass over that for time, but I thought you might find three descriptions of genocide interesting. First one actually comes from the ICTY, and I think is a good, humane account. This is what the appeals chamber in the case of Krstic said. The crime is horrific in its scope. Its perpetrators identify entire human groups for extinction. Those who devise and implement genocide seek to deprive humanity of the manifold richness its nationalities, races, ethnicities, and religions provide. This is a crime against all humankind, its harm being felt not only by the group targeted for destruction, but by all of humanity. Here's another definition, I'll read only part of it, by a witness we called in the Milošević case, Ton Zvan, an expert in genocidal studies. And he, speaking of the etiology and genesis of genocide and mass crimes, spoke of various stages which characterize perhaps more the ordinary understanding of genocide. It must define a target group. Property of the members of that group must be expropriated. The group must be concentrated in a single area. The group must be deported, and a significant number of the group must be killed. Now, this is, of course, much broader than the very strict moment of genocide conceived of by the Convention or by the crimes in the ICTY statute, the International Criminal Court statute, and various domestic statutes. And perhaps it begins to go back to Lemkin's original conception of this particular word. And now here's a third and final one before I move to something else. In Open Democracy, his article on the 13th of December of 2005, Hrant Dink wrote the following, dealing with the history of Armenia, to which I will come very briefly, because I'm not an expert in the subject, and I'll come to it via America, and not just because I'm here, but because it's a convenient way to approach it. But this is what Hrant Dink said in 2005. He spoke of deportation of people who'd lived on a territory for 3,000 years, people who produced culture and civilization being torn from the land that they lived on, and those who survived being dispersed all over the world. He said that on territory for 3,000 years, people who produced culture and civilization on this territory were torn. Sorry, that's a repeat. If we look at the next passage, And we see what he then went on to say. What is its name? He said. The discipline of law can be preoccupied with this question. But whatever it decides, the law, we know exactly what we have lived through. It can be understood, even if I should not use the word genocide, as being a tearing up of the roots. Genocide has wide application despite the shortness of its life as a term. How it should be applied, legally and otherwise, is a difficult question. But it's a question for us as citizens. It is not the preserve of lawyers who are the servants of citizens, not their masters. Those who might believe in the desirability of the world being run by liberals of no belief have no constituency for which they can, in public, have a dream. So maybe they have to find a way for dreaming by the surrogacy of others. Imagined intelligent aliens from black holes a very long way away who might be unwise enough to visit us and to escape the risk of being eaten in the blue bit or farmed in the yellow, brown, and green bit. If they overcame those obstacles and viewed what I've already described, but with greater intelligence, what might they say about states that encourage people to tell the truth, but keep back information that would make the truth more swiftly available? What do you think they'd say, people of superior intelligence, about that? What would their prescription be to remedy some of the problems that I've recounted to you that lie in the way, some of the obstacles that lie in the way of narrowing the gap between the truth that victims seek and what currently is on offer by authorities dealing with these issues? What would they say, these greater intelligences, if they heard about trials that last 10 years in the case of the propagandist in The Hague and some of the other long trials? You may come back to our intelligent friends, but only briefly and a little later. But since I ended with a reference of the last segment to what the journalist Hrant Dink wrote, let me just tell you this as well. Last year I gave a lecture with Nevenka Tromp, who's sitting here in the front row, about Srebrenica. And I thought, maybe I'd better go back and look at some of the newspapers. Srebrenica happened on and following the 11th of July, 1995. And remember, the court cases are still lasting 22 years later. On the 28th and 29th of October, 1995, in the New York Times, various journalists, I don't know how much of this is legible from where you are, but this is a very tiny extract of the things that the journalists were able to establish just a couple of months after that killing spree started. They established that it was known in advance that it was going to happen, that the critical air support that was required from General Janvier was denied, that hostages were taken by Mladic to keep the UN away, the Dutch retreated and that 20,000 terrified people joined them, and so on and so forth. Within a couple of months, the journalists had found out not everything, but a very great deal of the facts that were wanted and that would, even now, provide the base of the sort of findings that the victims of Srebrenica wanted. And perhaps it's time to ask why, when we live in a modern information age, where information can be obtained and disseminated so efficiently and so quickly, why we don't seem to be taking more advantage of it? Right, let me, as I promised, move on from, that's really part one and a bit of part two. Part three follows an intermission about Armenia, sort of. I said that nothing much happened in the development of the law between the First World War and the Second World War. No, I beg your pardon, between the Second World War and 1993, when the Yugoslav and the Rwanda tribunals were established. But one thing did happen, and it concerns Vietnam. Now, in those times, those of us who are able to remember this, there's a lot of demonstrating going on all around the world. Some of us a bit keener to stay at the back, away from the hooves of the police horses. But nevertheless, there was a lot of it going on. But we weren't demonstrating for a court. We were demonstrating to have some political effect, and many people think it had political effect. But Bertrand Russell, Lord Russell, an English philosopher, thought otherwise. And he thought that there should be a tribunal to decide whether America had indeed committed crimes. Here he is with Jean-Paul Sartre and... Sorry? Simone de Beauvoir, yes, thank you. He slightly packed his tribunal with people who, of the same persuasion, and he made other mistakes, like only trying one side of the conflict, but he engaged in an evidence-based analysis of what had happened, and there has been no other. Pretty obvious why. I mean, who would dare? Well, he did. And what's more, if you read what Jean-Paul Sartre said after, I can't remember whether it's the first or second session, you'll see what he says about genocide and America. Why do I mention that? Well, what Russell did, however imperfectly, and it is the only evidence-based record, has been repeated in other places, sometimes with very considerable success, sometimes less success. For example, the Comfort Women Tribunal, a really important event dealing with the sexual slavery of women from many nations that General MacArthur was certainly not going to bring to trial when he kept the emperor out of the dock. Well, the Comfort Women Tribunal did bring it to trial in 2000, and they did find the emperor responsible. And that was presided over by Judge Gabrielle Kirk MacDonald, a very senior appeal court judge from the United States of America. But, of course, 55 years had passed and nearly all the victims were dead. You remember the 10,000 people I spoke of who probably have died? Well, it was a greater percentage by far for the unfortunate Comfort Women. But the tribunal brought a result. There's another tribunal which I've been involved in a minor capacity, the Iran tribunal, dealing with the massacre by the Ayatollahs in the 1980s. Informal tribunals can work. And going back to what I said about journalism and the information age, they are inexpensive because you can do things by Skype, you can do things on the internet. They can be run by non-specialists, for the most part, around the world, and they can set records where other people are not prepared to set them. As I say, I'm not going to say anything in detail or in particular about Armenia. I'm not an expert, and for a range of reasons, I couldn't possibly express an opinion. But let me just tempt you to consider the following. If you take, let's be general, an historic event that is still troublesome because of its nature and because it hasn't been finally resolved, is there a sequence of questions you might want to ask before you decide whether to do anything about it? Well, you might say, is it going to go away? If the answer is yes, you can forget it. But if it's not going to go away, you ask, is it in the public interest that it should be resolved? If the answer to that is yes, you move on to the next stage and you say, are there some remaining property rights, even though this is a historic event? And if so, can they be resolved by particular tribunals? If so, defer to the tribunals. If not, how else can we deal with it? If there's no international body that will deal with it, and the International Court of Justice is very unlikely to be even able to deal with such an issue if it's a historic and unwilling to do so in any event. So what could you do next? Well, if you were one of the parties to the unresolved issue, quite possibly the party thought by many to be the bad party, you could say, we will establish and fund through mechanisms that will make a body completely independent of us. And that's not difficult to achieve. You just have to introduce an intervening layer of independence in order to create some kind of informal tribunal. We will fund it. We will live with the result, which we will not challenge. We will bear the consequences, even if this is the act or actions of our predecessors of decades ago. We will live with the consequences. Well, it won't happen, I suppose. Because, of course, no state owns up to anything. That's only something the poor little chap who's caught speeding or burglaring, he's expected to own up, but not a state. States don't own up, not for themselves. But supposing they did, supposing such an almost romantic idea of disinterested generosity by a state were to happen. However bad the result for that state, what moral leadership it would be given. Such a state could turn to America and say, why aren't you doing the same thing for Vietnam? Or to Russia and say, why haven't you done this for the gulags? It'd be nice if it happened. Maybe we'll ask our intelligent aliens what they think of it before we bid them farewell. There, incidentally, is the tribunal taking evidence. Let me turn briefly now to my last part of the three parts I said I'd tell you, and it concerns Israel-Gaza. I only got involved in Israel-Gaza a few years ago when I started representation of people concerned with the flotilla of vessels that in 2010 was said to have tried to break the blockade on Gaza. The lead vessel was a vessel called the Mavi Marmara. There it is. And when it and the other vessels were 70 miles off the Gazan or Israeli shore, so well into international waters, the Israeli Defense Force attacked, and with helicopters and ships, and 9 people were killed. There they are on different parts of the decks of the vessel by gunfire. One survived for some years in a coma and then died, and hundreds of people on board, it is said, were humiliated, assaulted, and so on. And the case has, or the event has been the subject of various bits of litigation. And from those events, I just want to draw a couple of points for you to consider. It has been thought for many years that Israel has been well protected and kept away from the supervision of something like the International Criminal Court by its powerful friend, the United States, sitting on the Security Council, which would never allow it to be referred, whether it's in the right or the wrong, to the International Criminal Court for anything that's happened. But do you know what happened on the Mavi Marmara? Well, the Mavi Marmara happened to be sailing, and I don't think it was cynically engineered, happened to be sailing under the flag of the Comoros States. And I don't want any of you to be embarrassed if you don't know where the Comoros States are, because I certainly didn't. They're north of Madagascar and east of Africa, a couple of islands. But because the vessel was sailing under their flag, and because the Comoros States had signed up to and ratified the Rome Statute, attacking this vessel was pretty much like attacking Comoros. And so Comoros referred the matter straight away to the International Criminal Court for the matter to be investigated. Was this a crime committed by Israel, or was it a perfectly lawful thing for them to have done? Why do I mention that? Well, we're tempted, aren't we, to see events in a somewhat gloomy way, and I don't think my presentation so far will have necessarily been to a contrary effect. It hasn't been full of optimism. But isn't it interesting to see how unexpected little things can happen? I'm sure nobody was really expecting Comoros to bring Israel, at least to bring Israel to the possibility of being considered. I express no view about the rights or wrongs, not for me to do that, just the desirability of the matter being dealt with by a court. And so here it is, to this extent, a happy event. Incidentally, it's another of the second of the 3 things I'm going to tell you about this event is that there were various commissions of highly intelligent senior people set up by the United Nations, Human Rights Council, and by the Israeli Defense Force and the Israeli government to investigate these things. And one of the issues that will, in due course, need to be resolved, maybe at the International Criminal Court, maybe in one of the 2 cases now being run in respect of different parts of this event here in the United States of America. One of the things will be whether there was firing from the helicopters before any Israeli Defense Force people landed on the deck. And I wonder what our intelligent alien friends would think of the fact that these 3 different commissions all reached conclusions about that particular issue pretty much in line with partisan expectations. So the Israeli Defense Force said, no. Their commission said, no firing from above. The Human Rights Council said, yes, firing from above. And the United Nations, having been embarrassed by the United Nations Human Rights Council, said, well, we don't know. How can it be that the same event can draw from intelligent and educated people partisan conclusions? I don't know. And the third thing about this particular case that I was going to mention is tragic, really tragic, but possibly with, if you look very hard, a silver lining. The prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, when presented with a referral of the kind that the Comoros made, has to answer the question whether she will or will not investigate. That's all she has to do at that first stage. She doesn't have to investigate. She only has to say, I will or I won't. And it, I'm afraid, took her a long time to make a decision. 18 months. We did try to help her a little bit. You know, went and saw her, I think, and gave her some documents. And one can't say what pressures there may be operating on high officials where issues involving Israel arise. But 18 months. And eventually, indeed, she decided that she wouldn't investigate and is being compelled by the pre-trial chamber of the court to reconsider that position. But the tragedy is that between the referral and her decision was the summer of 2014, when in an event called Operation Protective Edge by the Israelis, 2,200 people were killed, 2,100 of them Palestinians in Gaza, 500 of those children, 100 or a bit under on the Israeli side. Express no views about the rights or wrongs of that particular conflict. But what one can say, and this is the silver lining, if there is one, is that people must now recognize that had the prosecutor said before the summer of 2014, I will exercise my powers at least to consider what's happened, might it be the case that the unaimed missiles that were said to be the criminal acts by Hamas and the onslaught onto the limited territory of Gaza that were said to be the crimes by the other side wouldn't have happened because people would recognize on both sides that there was a law and that it was slowly but surely reaching its arms out to embrace in a controlling way the bad things that may be done in war. Well, I must end, and we must indeed bid farewell to our aliens. What would they say of what we've just heard? I hope they would have found some favor with the idea of nations behaving themselves in the way that they expect of their citizens, setting up independent bodies that could act with due speed to investigate themselves or their predecessors in a dispassionate way that would serve the interests of victims. I hope, in short, that they would be able to give advice that would indeed serve the interests of victims and put those interests above the interests of states, whatever those interests may be, in keeping things secret for 50, 40, 30 years. Do you remember those of you who were at the inaugural lecture that we were told not just about the Balfour Declaration, with which many of us are familiar, but about the terrible memorandum that Balfour, now Lord Balfour, wrote sometimes later, acknowledging quite candidly the way in which England had no intention of reflecting political rights of the Palestinian people at all, and had every intention, as he described it so graphically, of breaking every undertaking they've given. Don't we think it's right that we should put those interests, the interests of the victims, above these rather cynical interests of states? Well, Europe may be disintegrating from the European community. We may be returning again to a world of nation states. Africa may withdraw from the International Criminal Court, and the expectation that I referred to at the beginning of accountability being a right of human beings may dissipate. But if we, the citizens, hold our nerve, all will not be lost. And what I believe to be the slight encouragement that can be found in reduction, certainly per global capita or globally per capita, in the number of deaths caused in armed conflicts, we hope that may continue on its downward or slightly downward path. And these are all things that we, the citizen, can help. If we focus in our own work, but also in what we demand of our governments by way of provision of information, if we focus on the interests of those victims whose interests are not served by secrecy and who are served by the earliest and the fullest production of what may narrow the gap between the truth and what is otherwise available in dealing with what are indeed complex truths to be made available to those who need them.
Yes, thank you, Sir Geoffrey. I thought towards the end that this was a feast with all the bitter and the spicy and even the burning hot. If properly handled, it can do something like a feast, and that's what it was, including the burning. Yes. I thought that there is one key category there before we turn to the audience that maybe I could ask you to expand on, and that is intent. And that was such a key category there, but obviously one had to talk about other matters, and that just left a deep imprint in our minds, in my mind at least, but was left there. What, either through examples of the cases you prosecuted in different parts of the world, in Bosnia or elsewhere, or in a more conceptual vein, what exactly is the latest thinking on the question of intent in matters of this sort, of course, in matters of crime against humanity?
I'm not sure whether there's any latest thinking, but what is clear from the judgments of the various courts is that dealing with intent is a very difficult problem. And you wouldn't expect it otherwise, for two reasons. First of all, if you take someone like Milošević, who was President of Serbia for, the 10-year period of 3 conflicts, is it really likely that every day he got up with a criminal intent? Or in those days when things were going well and he was being treated as a statesman, might he have preferred that day to have had a rather decent intent and to have hoped that he could live out a better life? And on other days he gets up with a different intent. People don't necessarily have a constant intent right the way through, and that's one difficulty. The second difficulty I think I've already adverted to, which was that the courts have looked not necessarily just at the individual, they've looked at the overall structure, which is quite the overall structure of an attack. And that's quite problematic because, to me at any event, because of course the foot soldier, the sergeant, the captain, the major, the colonel, the general, the field marshal, the Ministry of Defense and the Prime Minister and the President, they may all have very different mental intentions for what is actually done by the soldier on the, in the field, killing people and doing what is found to have the particular wicked intent. And several of them may not have that intent. And yet, the judges have to go through this process of finding an intent, the genocidal intent, attaches to the conduct of a group of people. And then they say, aha, what about Mr. So-and-so? In the Milošević case, of course, it didn't reach a conclusion because he died before the end of the trial. But the judges at the end of the prosecution's case reviewed all the evidence, and two of the judges found that there was enough evidence to go ahead to make Milošević, face the charge put on his own defense in respect of direct genocide of Srebrenica. And they make it clear that they couldn't do that on the basis of a particular thing he said. They had to look at all the evidence and judge from that. Well, all of that's fine. And it's not that different in character from Mr. A, Mr. B, and Mr. C charged with a conspiracy to murder X in a national system, where you still have to look at all the evidence concerning Mr. A and Mr. B and Mr. C. The problem, I think, is the problem I said at the beginning. It's so complicated that it's bound always to be a matter of controversy. And I've already given my view on the desirability of continuing with genocide as it stands at the moment. There is for us to consider the advantage of simplicity and certainty that come from different conceptions of the law.
Thank you. We have a mic that can go around. I'll turn to you, Homi, in a second. And there is also a mic right here that you can go up to ask your questions also at that point. Homi is the first I saw raising his hand, so let's start with Homi. Another thing I forgot to mention as the mic is going around, and it is definitely worth mentioning, is the book that is on sale over there. This really is a remarkable biography, just published in English. The Turkish publication was last year, and it is by Tuğba Çandar. Is she here by chance? Harry, is she here? No. Okay. The book is available out there. Yes. Homi, please.
Thank you, Sir Geoffrey, for a very, very compelling speech, which raised the stakes of the question with a great kind of forensic and dramatic rhetorical presence. And I think that made the issue extraordinarily alive for us. I too wanted to ask you about intent. But my question is, why originally was intent introduced in the convention? What was the original thinking that made this category, and what is the genealogy, legally or philosophically, of that category? A category which is clearly, as you say, enormously complex, because you have to have intent proven at almost all levels as an overwhelming structure of thought and action before you can apply it to any particular case. I mean, that in itself is a daunting project. So I'm interested to know why it was introduced right at the start. What was it supposed to safeguard? What was it supposed to secure? What kind of ethical value was it supposed to ensure? That is my question.
And I'm afraid I'm not sufficiently knowledgeable of the detail of the negotiations to answer your question in a scholarly way. But I hope that the London conference records that you can find in Avalon might give some guidance to that. But from right at the beginning of Lemkin's own definition, where he was looking at the destruction of groups of individuals by racial or ethnical group, but on a wider basis, it always came, the concept always was that A wants to destroy B, and wants to destroy B, or the culture of B, or the group of B, for an irrational or not for a rational reason. You can obviously want for military reasons to destroy a particular group of people, and as long as war remains lawful, that can be a reasonable decision. It doesn't sound a very attractive decision, but it can be a reasonable one. But right from the beginning, as I understand it, it was always his concern that you should look at the desire to destroy groups simply because they were groups by one mechanism or another, and that it was that thinking that finds itself reduced into the particular terms of the convention. But I'm afraid I can't help you more.
Could I just ask one very quick thing? Is the intent issue related to destroying the entire culture of a people? Does it relate really to the culture and the question of cultural memory?
Well, it doesn't, of course, in the legal setting, need to destroy a whole group. It's only required that it destroy a significant part of a group. So that's the answer to that question. But I think, again, Lemkin's original scheme was rather broader than that. And when you looked at both Hrant Dink's approach to what happened 101 years ago, and when you looked at what Tons Van was saying about the process as he understands it as a scholar, in each of those you've got a much wider concept of intent. Whereas the legal one, it has to be said, actually allows, the legal one allows, and there was a case in Germany about this, you to have an intent even though you kill only one person, but you kill that person having the intent to kill a significant part of the group. And that's another reason for distinguishing between, or finding a distinction between, the criminal and the more general approach to it.
So, Geoffrey, I also enjoyed the talk, but I wonder if it isn't, you know, an ancient and irresolvable issue at its heart, which is that these terrible events are deeply moral questions. There is no way to resolve a moral question publicly. Hence, the legal system becomes the de facto mechanism for the resolution. That resolution then always is inadequate, A, because the legal system cannot provide a moral solution, and B, because some of the ways that the legal system works will produce technical legal issues, like in this instance, intent, which seem both erroneous and in some way obscene with regard to what the moral issue really is about. And in this regard, isn't even the area that you gave us of hope, the tribunal, and at least if we use the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions and some of the analyses of them, like our own Martha Minnow's study of the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, isn't it always going to be inadequate because it is a quasi-legal forum when in fact it's a moral resolution that publics want? And indeed, let me just say one other thing. Just in regard to your idea of liberals running the world, isn't actually one of the reasons why religions still have cachet, an important and useful cachet, is that whatever you think, they do attempt to address moral problems. The solutions may not be great.
Well, there's a lot for me there to deal with, and I can only pray in my defense that I said at the beginning, my proposition about the liberal non-believer has to be countered by my acceptance of the possible preference for the alternative out of recognition of the right for the other side to be heard. But coming back to the first part of your observation, can I just chuck in before I come to deal with it, something I meant to say earlier. the impossibility of the law dealing with these issues is in one sense made manifest by the fact that the tomes of judgment, 300, 400, 500, 600 pages of closely argued legal and factual analysis by the judges is probably of little or no value to the victims, because it doesn't deal, and it's not the judge's fault. They simply can't deal in a crisp way with what the victims genuinely and generally see as a very simple issue to which they want a very simple answer. Now, that's not to say that that's not exactly the same distinction I think that you're drawing between a moral and a legal attempt at resolution of a moral issue, but it's somewhere in the same general area. Do I think that and what you're saying, especially when you contrast it with the Truth Commission and put the tribunals on the same tide as the ordinary legal issue, what you're, I think, saying is that perhaps the law can have no role to play at all in these events. I think that's a perfectly reasonable position to take, but it lands up meaning that you can't start anywhere in holding any person, however manifestly wicked, to account, say through domestic crimes. And that's not what people want. They want some much more general analysis of where rights and wrongs fell. And I think that many, but probably most people working in this field wish that the Truth and Reconciliation, or at least Truth Commission model, were more acceptable, more practiced, and more effective. But the problem there is that that requires a consent to act from all sides before it can be effective, which is why it's only been effective really in South Africa, and it was only, that's not true, but it's been most effective in South Africa. And of course, even there, it was effective to some degree only because there was very strong pressures imposed on people. They weren't necessarily volunteers to the act. They weren't willing in the most basic sense of that word to unburden themselves. They were compelled to do so. So you have a number of conflicting interests and vectors here at work, making none of these solutions ideal. And it's in the way that transitional justice scholars, I think, tend to say it's better to have a composition of all these imperfect mechanisms working together, truth and reconciliation, some criminal process, along with all the other processes of memorialization. That may well still be the only way forward, and it may be, in its own way, a real recognition that there is no single solution to the problem. But the victim, even the generous victim, wants to know what happened. And if the informal tribunals are categorized in the way that I think your question would categorize them, tarred with the same brush as the legal process, then we're offering them nothing. And we must offer them something. I've not been a victim. I don't know how important it is before you end the life to which you've been compelled to be a part, how important it is to bring a conclusion to the business of being a victim. Silence.
There is one more. There were.
Thank you very much for this great
Can you
talk.
please introduce yourself briefly?
I'm Emrah. I'm from Turkey. I'm a scientist at Harvard Medical School. So first of all, I think you are lucky that you are a human rights lawyer not from Turkey, because we just lost Tahir Elçi from Turkey, that Miss Dink was also there for the ceremony. So my question will be regarding to this blank page, that the evidence that the public is not able to see. Who exactly decide to hide this very important information from the public is my first question. And you, as a part of this process, how is it possible that you are not able to change this and make it public, or the people, so even you cannot reach to this information, for instance, this transcription, the phone call between the Milošević and the other person? Thank you.
I wish I could. I can't because I don't have the power. We, the public, are actually very tolerant of the exercise of secrecy by our governments. They assume it's their right, and we aren't that brave in challenging it. In that particular example, where instructions were given that we would withdraw our application to obtain and use this material, I had no, as it happens, I had no ability within the management structure of the United Nations to overturn the decision that was made, however much I disagreed with it. All I knew was that at the end of the trial, I had to deal with an ethical problem, namely to present to the defendant in a way that he could use the certainty that I had that the prosecution authority generally was vulnerable to pressure from outside sources. Sounds a bit complicated, but it seemed to me the fact that pressure was effective was something I needed at some stage, had he not died, to explain to the defendant in a way that he could use. I hope that's understandable, but if it isn't, I can generalize it in a way that I think comes from your question but doesn't answer it. If we're concerned to narrow the gap between truth and uncertainty, and we come up against the non-provision of material by whoever, then we must perhaps make more of that and make more of it in public than we tend to do. And we should have processes whereby we make public and we shame people, organizations, and governments that don't produce what they have to produce. It may have no effect. Governments are remarkably thick-skinned and can get away with all sorts of things. But that I think we have to do. And it's part of the business that I haven't touched on of the Julian Assange and the other whistleblowers. They're problematic because they possibly do bring real danger to real individuals who are blameless. I don't know enough about it, but I suspect they do. But nevertheless, they are part of a stream of activity that shows a disinclination by the public to allow things to remain secret when they can be forced into the open. And I think that we generally owe a duty, wherever we can, to explain, naming and shaming, if we are allowed to, who it is who suppressed information. You will have noticed I haven't named and shamed. And that's because I'm not allowed to. And when I say not allowed to, I mean that there would be sanctions, and I have to weigh the consequence of facing those sanctions.
Please.
I was going to ask you to talk more about the Truth and Reconciliation commissions, but I'm really glad that it was touched on. But I just wanted to mention one thing, and I really appreciated your the breadth with which you presented everything, which I think gives people a sense that they can do something. And I think that when it's relegated to international courts, which, as you say, take decades to decide things, people feel very powerless. And I think one of the important things about de-victimizing people is to give people power. And in 1971, you probably know about this, it wasn't publicized very well, but there was something in this country called the Winter Soldier Investigation, which was Vietnam veterans testifying about what crimes they had committed in Vietnam. I was working with active duty vets, active duty GIs and vets, and was a part of that, and it was I thought it was a very important event which deburdened the people who had committed the crimes, for which they realized afterwards they were deeply, deeply regretting. And so I just wanted to know if you wanted to talk any more about the role of an average citizen here who can help bring things, I think, to the public's consciousness.
I know very little about, and I've only read very little about the 1971 process that you referred to. When I read about it, I think when I was trying to find out whether I was right in the assertion that Russell was the only evidence-backed process that had dealt with the thing comprehensively. But other than that, no. Yes, I think what lies beneath your question is fundamentally important. And as I and friends and colleagues have worked our way through over I've only been involved in this line of business for 18 years. I was a regular lawyer before the chance brought me to deal with it. But as over those 18 years I've looked at these things with various other people, it's easy to think that the most important people are the victims who society rarely focuses on when there are other people to focus on. But in fact, the most important people to focus on are, of course, the perpetrators. The perpetrators.
Who became victims, really?
No, because the victims are going to be there, tragically to say, because they are victims, like it or not. The only way that you can stop people becoming victims is if you can understand and control the activity of the perpetrators. The truth commissions have been successful to some degree in eliciting the explanation for what people did in public ways. And there are other examples, but they're always very limited, of people who come forward and tell the truth. There were some in the Yugoslav tribunal, but not very many, but very important when they did so. And we have to find ways, I think, of encouraging without giving them an amnesty, I suppose, because people want justice, and justice means punishment. We have to find ways of encouraging people to own up in the way that we'd like societies to own up and governments to own up. And on this particular topic, I suppose because it's slightly a favored topic of mine, slight digression. There was one man, and I don't know if this will help you, there was one man at the Yugoslav tribunal called Milan Babic, who was charged with war crimes for what happened in part of Bosnia. He was a Serb, a very religious man, or a religious man, a family man, and a dentist. And he'd been a leader for a short period of time and committed crimes. He admitted everything and gave evidence. He was genuinely contrite. He'd already been sentenced somewhat heavily. He was asked to give evidence again, and he gave evidence again, and he was humiliated again in the cross-examination by those representing Serb defendants. And he killed himself before he gave evidence on the third occasion. What I think is most disturbing for me, and I don't know if this resonates in any way with any of you, is that the tribunal didn't really give a damn. He was dead, he was gone. And somehow I thought that that showed that people weren't understanding the significance of confession, cooperation, and explanation by perpetrators. I'm not saying that his death means that there will be less who would volunteer to provide the explanations in the way he did. But I do think it's important that we encourage people to do that. There's a startling film, by the way, about the terrible Indonesian, there are two films actually, about the terrible Indonesian massacres of the 1960s, I think. And if you ever see them, one's got the title Something to Do with the Sky, you'll see how a particularly intuitive
journalist or television presenter or whatever he was. He was an optician, I think. Managed to get people to reveal exactly what they did. It's a peculiar skill, and it comes in different ways and in different settings, but it's very important that we develop it.
Thank you, Sir Geoffrey. I'm afraid we're out of time, but I would like to invite everyone to the reception to continue the conversation. But right now, we're past 8 o'clock, and we should say farewell to our speaker for the moment. Thank you.